Well, folks, we've got a bajillion cards in this video. Man, I've been recording card reviews for a while today, but we're kicking it off with Imp King Rafam, the new legendary for Warlock, and it's all about imps for Warlock. We're going to see some additional imp synergy cards, but for Rafam, he's a 6 mana 6/6 with Battlecry Resurrect 4 friendly imps and then infuse 5 if he's been in hand and 5 friendly minions have died while he's sitting in hand. Then he's also going to give your imps +2/+2. So this is essentially a gigantic board builder for 6 mana in a imp deck. And you can assume a 6/6 plus a bunch of 3/3s at a minimum. And in fact, there are some larger imps with effects as well. If you want to just look at the imp pool real quick, currently in standard format, not including cards revealed today, there are a handful of different ways to make imps. Some 3/3s, some 1/1s, some 2/4s, 2/5s. 3/2s, kind of all different shapes and sizes, mostly early game, of course, but still lots of different imp bodies that can feed into this. And that kind of feels like almost a, Baron Glacier sort of board, essentially kind of finisher of sorts, a board-based finisher at least for an imp-based deck. You tempo out a bunch of imps throughout the early to mid game, then you dump Rafam on 6. Hopefully that's kind of the backbreaker that your opponent can't quite deal with all these crazy imps. Essentially, oh my god, this is too many. Remember also too that if you do have a few imps left on board, you can play Rafam if he's infused just as a board buff. Doesn't really matter if he's summoning the imps. If you already have 3 on board, you're adding 6 damage. That could actually be like a lethal push as well, almost like a bloodlust style of effect. So it could be a legitimate finisher as well, which I think does add quite a bit of utility to this card. So a reload, a board-based finisher, a damage finisher. Imp King Rafam can actually do quite a few things and feels very efficient at 6 mana. That's the right sort of cost for a card like this one. So I think Rafam's actually pretty solid. So Vile Library is a new location for Warlock. This one's going to give a friendly minion a +1/+1, and it's going to repeat for each imp that you control. So if you are going to have, cards that summon 3-4 imps very efficiently, Vile Library could be a very cheap buff. So spend 2 mana to set this up, and then, build a board on turn 3 or 4, hit the location button, and you might be able to add, 4/4 in extra stats, 5/5 in extra stats for free the same turn you're summoning the minions. Or, of course, if you manage to stick something like an Imp Gang boss, for instance, that summons imps, remind you, you might even be able to put these stats into action immediately, taking some great value trades or just pushing for some extra face damage as well. And this does feel like it'll be a very high impact, high efficiency buff in an imp deck because there are a lot of ways to go wide. The only concern is giving up that 2 mana of tempo in a deck that probably cares a lot about putting minions in play. It might still be worth it because this deck can kind of like reload with wide boards over and over again. They don't necessarily have to keep up that momentum from like turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. So taking a little bit of a downturn for a bigger stabilizer later and a bigger swing board later, I think is actually pretty acceptable. I think this has enough immediate stat impact, and you get to reload multiple times with multiple location hits as well, that this actually makes a lot of sense. Moving on to Impending Catastrophe. I love the artwork on this card, by the way. It looks sick. 2 mana shadow spell for Warlock. It draws you a card, and then it repeats for each imp that you control. And this is insane card draw. Because with things like Fiendish Circle, summoning 4 imps, a traded Wicked Shipment, of course, summoning 4 imps for 1 mana, you might have a 5 card drawn 3 mana play. That's insane. There are so many ways to go wide with these imps. This feels like a fantastic reload. This deck seems like it's going to have just wave after wave, building imp boards, building threats. Warlock already has some natural card draw built in as well. So it seems like endless waves of stuff coming at you with this hyper efficient card draw. This card seems completely bonkers to me with how cheap and easy it is to summon imps. Definitely keep an eye on Impending Catastrophe because that is a lot of cards drawn. Moving on, we have the Mischievous Imp. It's a 4 mana 3/3 imp with Battlecry. Summon a copy of this, and if you've infused 3, it's going to summon 2 copies instead. So to base level, 4 mana 2 3/3s, not super exciting in these modern days of Hearthstone. 4 mana 3 3/3s, now you're starting to talk. It's still not like the craziest play, but feels good, and certainly, as another mid-game imp reload and board builder for all these other imp synergy cards. So this certainly feels like it's going to play in rather nicely. Just wave after wave again of imps. This one fits in well. It's going to be pretty easy to infuse in an imp based deck. You're going to have a lot of little things dying constantly, so I think this will go off pretty regularly and feel like it's a nice part of the imp puzzle. Probably not the highest power, you know, outlier individually, but will still feel relevant to the deck. Next up, you have the Flustered Librarian, a 1-mana 1/3 that has +1 attack for each imp you control. And yeah, I mean, these 1/3s that scale on aggressiveness have proven themselves time and time again. We got Vicious Slither Spears and Mana Worms and Tunnel Trogs and so on and so forth. I think this actually fits in really well. Again, you might be concerned that you're not summoning imps early and getting the train running, but this still feeds into Infuse synergies. It still creates that early board presence and pressure and damage output. You're going to be able to bump this attack by +4, +5 very often in the mid game, early game, even turn 3. Gosh, you can pump it by 2 with Wicked Shipments on turn 2 very easily. So it becomes a pretty threatening force very quickly. I think, again, this will feel like a strong card in Imp Warlock. So moving on to other classes, and speaking of strong cards, we have the Convincing Disguise, a new 1-mana shaman spell. It's going to transform a friendly minion into one that costs 2 more. So single target, 2-mana evolve. Also keep in mind, we've already seen things like Baroness Vash, who kind of feels like it goes in line with this really nicely. It's also got Infuse 4, transform all friendly minions instead. And remember, they're going to be transforming into cards that cost 2 more. So this is a super evolve effect. And that sounds really good. I think it has some baseline utility. It's not super powerful to baseline, but as soon as you infuse this, Convincing Disguise looks absolutely bonkers insane to me. It feels like Evolved Shaman has a lot of potential. It has been a deck that's proven itself in the past a couple times. So yeah, Convincing Disguise looks just fantastic. It's clear that this is going to be a high output, high power card. Moving on here to the Solid Alibi. I love this card art so much. His alibi is that he was frozen to the couch. That's amazing. It's a 2-mana frost spell. Until your next turn, your hero can only take 1 damage at a time. So damage denial here. I like the design of this a lot more than we've seen cards in the past, like ice blocks and timeouts and such, where it was just universal damage denial. This is in that same vein, buying yourself time, giving yourself a turn maybe to do something cool or stabilize a board, remove your opponent's stuff, but it's not just locking the opponent out. They still have ways to kill you, particularly if you're playing against an Imp Warlock with a lot of 1/1s. They may not even notice the difference in some cases, but if you're expecting your opponent to go for a big combo turn, they're going to hit you with a bunch of burst spells. They have some 8/8s on board. Solid Alibi is the kind of card that really disrupts their plans because it's just, there's nothing they can do. They're limited to taking 1 damage at a time. And as we've seen in duels with heavy armor where you can only take 1 damage at a time, it's still, you know, risky. There are still arcane missile style effects that blow you up very often, or, you know, you didn't feel like you did much at all. But there are other board states and scenarios where it feels like it really limits the opponent. So I think there will be slower mage decks who need time. They need to get to their Kel'Thuzad or combo piece or whatever it is, where Solid Alibi is a very useful tool. We also have the Stonebound Gargon for Hunter, a 4-mana 3/5 beast with Rush. And Infuse 3, it also damages the minions next to whomever this attacks. So a little bit of a board maintenance tool here for Hunter. You fall behind a little bit in the mid game, you need to kill your opponent's 3/3s, and boom, an infused Stonebound Gargon is going to be great at doing that, cleaning up those kind of early game board leftovers. And probably leaving you a little bit of a minion behind as well that kind of presents a problem for your opponent next turn if they want to reload with minions again. It's like, ah, crap, I can't really play much into that Stonebound Gargon. So they might have to play a little awkwardly or figure out some way to deal with this before redeveloping minions that die too easily to this same cleave style effect. Now, I will say at the moment, I don't really know if this fits into a deck especially well. You know, we've got kind of big beast death rattle stuff happening. I don't think that deck ever makes room for this. It's just developing so many giant bodies that this amount of reactivity in the mid game isn't really supporting it. They'd rather just start setting up for their own game plan, their own win condition. So I do see this card being one of those where, like, yeah, it makes sense on board in a vacuum, but in the context of a deck, I don't know how many decks will actually be able to squeeze this in. They'll probably need some sort of specific beast synergy or token synergies, and they're going to need to care about this reactivity as opposed to creating pressure. It feels like this could be one of those awkward ones that looks good, but just sort of falls to the wayside because it's not specific or narrow enough in its focus that decks really need to run it. And then we've also got the Red Herring here, a 7-mana 3/12 beast with Taunt. Your non-Red Herring minions have stealth. So basically here, I love this again, dude. The flavor of this is so amazing. It's a literal red herring, distracting your opponents from the real problem, which are the crazy stealth minions hiding behind it. So if you're able to create some scenario where you have some insanely high valued thing and you can protect it behind red herrings, and then maybe you have, I don't know, like an emergency maneuvers that brings the red herring back to life, you might be able to protect some win condition or asset, you know, a Malygos style card of old, where if you can keep it alive for multiple turns, it's just going to be a game winner. Now, I'll be honest, that feels like it's going to be very awkward to pull together. You're looking at, 7 mana here is like a setup that's sort of an indirect setup. It's still risky, still susceptible to all kinds of wideboard removals like Twisting Nethers and stuff. So I don't really think that's going to come together super well. This feels like one of those decks that when you randomly discover it, it's going to have some cool impact on the game. It's going to change things live on the fly in a really exciting way. But as far as actually running in a deck list, I don't know. This feels like it's going to be very, very hard. Is there a chance this is just good enough as a 12 health beast taunt? I don't know. I don't think so. I think, stuff like Mountain Bear for Hunter probably just feels like a more disruptive taunt and body than something like the Red Herring. So I don't think this makes the cut as is, just straight up for stat line total. And I think although the effect is really interesting and fun, probably more on the meme side of things than the like legitimately competitive side of things. Beyond that, we also got this card, which currently does not have a final translation. So you'll see here, I kind of blurred out these names till we get the official name, something like a Devourer of some sorts. It's a 9-mana neutral. It's a 4/4 battle cry. Devour an enemy minion and gain its stats. So this feels a little bit like a targeted Abominable Lieutenant based on this wording. So you eat something big and this guy gets enormous. Then if you've infused it 5 times, remember that means 5 friendly minions died while this was sitting in your hand. Then it's also going to devour the adjacent minions as well. So if you pump this thing up, you're removing 3 minions. It gets absolutely insanely huge, especially if you eat insanely huge minions. And that could be some pretty interesting removal. I think in Arena, especially a card like this feels like it would just be absolutely insane, even at a base level. And then if it did get infused and your opponent did have a board for it, I mean, it's just like instant game-winning status in Arena. Seems nuts. So thankfully in Epic there, it seems like that won't be too common in Arena. Now outside of Arena, I think it's gonna be really tough for this card to see use cases. 9 mana makes it very expensive. A lot of decks just can't go that deep. Only classes that can go really late, like maybe Druid, maybe some Control Warriors, could make room for this, and Warrior maybe won't be quite as good as Infuse. Now you could see like an Infused Druid come together. We've already got Sire Nathria, thinks fits perfectly into Druid with all the different whelp summonings on Ixias. This might be a piece of that puzzle, but do they really need a card like this? Would they rather just run something that's game ending like a Sire Nathria? Does this complement that, or is it just kind of add in an extra demand on the Infused deck that isn't necessary? I think it's the latter. I think this is going to be very awkward and very hard for most decks to fit in. I think they'll have other ways to deal with things, or just play cards that intend to straight up end the game for their late game stuff. Or even just like this versus Onyxia, right? Onyxia still clears minions, still leaves things behind, but has a lot more flexibility, a lot less conditionality, and feels like it's a pressure generating card on top of being a reactionary card, whereas this is limited just to really dealing with your opponent's stuff. Doesn't present inherent threats in its own right if you need to play proactively, for instance. So I think this is in that Abominable Lieutenant state where there could be some very fringe deck that makes this work. Abominable Lieutenant popped up into some ramp druid lists very occasionally. This could do the same sort of thing, but won't be a hyper powerful card. Imp King Ratham is a 4-star card. Vile Library is a 4-star card. Impending Catastrophe is a 5-star card. Mischievous Imp is a 3-star card. Flustered Librarian is a 4-star card. Convincing Disguise is a 4-star card. Solid Alibi is a 3-star card. Stonebound Gargon is a 2-star card. Red Herring is a 2-star card. This dude, whose name we still don't know, is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this particular card review. Cool to see another new deck here with Imps. Little nervous how focused and kind of pre-designed all these decks are. Sometimes that can be a problem, these really parasitic designs, but still looks really fun, at least in the short term. Curious to hear your thoughts on Ratham. Will Imp Warlock make sense? Will it get there? Will it be a meta deck? I want to hear those thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.